All right, so we're going to start talking about the New Deal. And the first place we really need to start is with the election of 1932. This is the election of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt is an interesting character. He's born in 1882. He's actually the fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, who was, of course, a former president in the United States. He served as Undersecretary of the Navy during the First World War and ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920. In 1921, he contracted polio, which caused him to lose the use of his legs. However, he kept his confinement to a wheelchair a complete secret, and most Americans in the pre-television era never knew that he couldn't walk while he was president. And also, he tended to give off a certain air of energy and vitality about him. You'll notice in the cartoons, much like the one we're looking at here, Roosevelt is standing up, offering his remedies and stuff like that. So yeah, most Americans had no idea. So Roosevelt is running in 1932 on a promise of a New Deal for the American people. Now, this is somewhat vague. There are a few things that he advocates for, things like balancing the federal budget, and he spent a lot of time criticizing Hoover for his excessive spending towards the end of his presidency, which is kind of ironic given that the New Deal involves a large amount of government spending. But probably the biggest difference between the two parties in 1932 was that the Democrats actively called for a repeal to prohibition. Now, generally speaking, Roosevelt got extremely popular reception from the American people because in 1932, we were itching for new leadership. Basically, anyone could have beaten Herbert Hoover in 1932. And so the outcome to the election was much as you would imagine. FDR wins a landslide victory over Herbert Hoover in the Electoral College and wins 57% of the popular vote. He also comes into office with a strong, commanding majority in Congress to get his program passed. So between the time that Roosevelt is elected president in November of 1932 and the time he takes office in March of 1933, things get horribly worse for the Depression. Hoover is reluctant to do anything in this period because he's a lame duck president. He's on his way out. He doesn't really want to do anything without the okay of his successor. But FDR understandably doesn't want to make any decisions until he's officially inaugurated into office. And so nothing is happening in these sort of 4, almost 5 months between the election and FDR's inauguration. And what Roosevelt is faced with at the beginning of his presidency is a huge banking crisis. Now, the New Deal is intended to be an alternative to socialist ideas and sort of Nazi-style or laissez-faire solutions. It's intended to be something in the middle of the road. We don't want a program like what we'd been doing before, very laissez-faire-esque, hands-off, letting the market run itself. But we also don't want sort of socialist or even authoritarian involvement in our governing and our lives. Instead, FDR was hoping to reconcile democracy with individual liberty, with economic recovery and development. But again, he doesn't really have a real blueprint for this. Instead, he surrounds himself with a circle of advisors, people he relied very, very heavily on for their advice. These are made up of intellectuals, social workers, and others who played key roles in the administration. People like the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, who was in fact the first woman named to a cabinet position, and the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickles. Louis Brandeis, who is now also a member of the Supreme Court, also offers a good amount of advice to Roosevelt. Now, each of these groups, and even within the group, you see some variation on outlook, how this is supposed to take place. But a lot of it is rooted in progressive style reform. Brandeis, for example, firmly believed that big corporations contributed to the Depression by keeping prices high and failing to increase workers' purchasing power. And so he wanted them broken up, not just regulated, but dismantled. However, the dominant preference in the brain trust, as it was called, was for regulated bigness. The brain trust of advisors saw bigness, as in big business, as inevitable in the American economy. And so they encouraged the regulation of big business. And ultimately, this is what won out. Now, like I said, Roosevelt is faced when he gets into office with an immediate crisis in the banking sector. Roosevelt is confronted with a banking system on the verge of collapse as bank funds that were invested in the market have lost value, causing frightened depositors to hurry to try and withdraw all of their savings from the banks. And as they're doing that, making the banks insolvent, and bank after bank is closing its doors as a result of this. Imagine the scene from Mary Poppins, where there's a run on the bank and everybody starts demanding their money. Yeah, that's kind of what's happening in banks across the nation in the United States at this time. So to try and cap this activity, Roosevelt immediately declares a national bank holiday, temporarily halting all banking activity in the United States for 5 days. In the meantime, he calls Congress into a special session and tells them basically, you need to come up with something that I can pass for this. And what they come up with is the Emergency Banking Act. This provided funds to try and shore up threatened institutions to keep them from collapsing. And then we also get the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act. This barred commercial banks from becoming involved in the buying and selling of stocks and helped to establish the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which insured the accounts of depositors so that if your bank goes under, the money you have deposited in that bank is not lost to you. The federal government will insure that money for you. This made people a little bit more easy with the banking sector, so that at the end of that bank holiday, when the banking activity resumed, people were less frightened and less encouraged to go and pull all their money out of the banks. Also, as part of this initiative, Roosevelt made the decision to remove the United States from the gold standard, a move that many of the other nations around the world had already taken. The goal here was the reversal of the banking crisis, and ultimately, Roosevelt succeeds in rescuing the financial system of the United States. But this is only the first act in a number of new measures that are passed. And so in our next video, we're going to take a look at some of those New Deal measures that are passed.